This podcast is brought to you by the School of Advanced Study, University of London.
Okay, hello and Happy New Year everyone, and welcome to the first Sport and Leisure History Seminar of the year and also the first Life Cycles Seminar of the year. This is a joint event between the two groups. The last one went so spectacular. I forget who the speaker was, but it was really good. But anyway, after that roaring success, we decided to go to team up again for a seminar on the oral histories of youth culture in 20th century Britain, and specifically second half of 20th century Britain, but that would have been a rather long title, so I just went for 20th century. So I apologise any of you who are hoping for a bit of early 20th century youth culture, you're going to be disappointed. But for the rest of you who are here for the second half of the 20th century, you're in for a delight, hopefully. So, no pressure.
Oversell much.
So, our two speakers are Hannah Charnock from the University of Exeter and Charlotte Clements, who's both at the University of Kent but also works at the University College London's Institute of Education. So our first speaker is Hannah, who's currently working on a PhD in the History Department at Exeter on adolescent sexuality in the long 1960s. And she's going to be giving a paper entitled For Fun Not the Future. I'll let you have the laptop because you want to get your... For Fun Not the Future, Adolescent Romance Culture and Sexuality in the Long 1960s. So both our speakers are going to speak for about roughly half an hour, and then we'll have questions at the end for both papers.
Excellent. So thank you for inviting me, and thank you all for coming on the 4th of January, which, yeah, very keen. So I'm quite excited to be here. Like Dion said, I am... well, I keep wanting to say just started my third year, but I just started in September, and that was quite a long time ago. And when you do oral history projects, Charlotte and I were talking about this earlier, you kind of have to front load all of your research, so you spend the most of the first couple of years doing all of your interviews, and then write it all up afterwards. So I'm kind of at that nice, exciting / hideous stage where I'm having to think about all of this stuff that I've done. So these are kind of my initial thoughts on the work that I've been doing, trying to get a big picture for my research. And I should kind of want to preface this by saying that my background is the history of sexuality and gender, and almost kind of medical history. So the history of leisure is quite a new area for me. This isn't literature that I have a huge amount of background in. So I'd be interested to hear what you make of this. So my paper today is called For Fun Not the Future, Adolescent Romance Culture and Sexuality in the Long 1960s. And what I want to do with this is to try to convince you of why we might need to rethink traditional models of courtship when looking at the mid-20th century, particularly among teenagers. So the alternative subtitle for this paper is In the Era of the Sexual Revolution, What Should We Do with the Early Onset of Heavy Petting? And I should warn you that heavy petting is a phrase that I end up using a lot in this paper, which is a hideous expression that has become kind of the bane of my existence. But it's the expression that all of my interviewees use because they don't like the other words associated with those behaviours. So I apologise for that. So if you look at the existing scholarship on kind of courtship and sexuality, there is definitely a sense that something changed in the mid-20th century. Pinpointing the exact moment of change, or kind of how this change happened, has proven to be quite difficult. And I think the easiest way of demonstrating that is by looking at the kind of chronological framings that historians have used for existing research projects. So kind of Selina Todd ends her work looking at the first half of the 20th century in 1950. Claire Langhammer finishes hers in 1960. Kate Fisher and Simon Sharita went theirs in 1963, and then Hera Cook hers in kind of 1975, I think. So there is some problem, some kind of fudging of the chronology here. And while I'm criticising almost other people for fudging their chronology, you'll notice that my paper is called kind of Adolescent Sexuality in the Long 1960s, which I take to mean kind of roughly 1956 with a bit of give to roughly 1976 with a bit of give, depending on the years that my interviewees were born and kind of what interesting bits fit where. But there is definitely a sense that young people's sexual behaviour was very different in the last quarter of the 20th century than it had been in the first half. And so for my PhD, I'm using oral histories to kind of interrogate adolescent sexuality in this delightfully fudged period, and to kind of tease out the nature of any of these shifts. And here's where this is an oral history paper, so I have to insert the kind of obligatory but slightly boring methodology section. So for my project, I've interviewed just under 50 individuals. I interviewed both men and women, but for the sake of this presentation today, I'm mainly talking about women for reasons that we can discuss later, but it basically comes down to the fact that men are less comfortable talking about this stuff. And so whilst they end up kind of giving up lots of interesting information, it's not necessarily in a way that's very accessible in slides in which you can only stick a couple of sentences. So we interviewed both men and women, and they were, the majority of them were born between 1940 and 1960. Within the history of girlhood, there is also some fudging of definitions. And so in a lot of the existing literature, when people are talking about young women, so particularly I think Selina Todd and Claire Langhammer, they talk about young women as girls who have left school. So it tends to be, for the earlier period, kind of 14, and for the later period, once the school age is extended, you're looking towards kind of 16, and sometimes even later than that. But obviously that then leaves a kind of huge gap for what do we do with these young women who aren't really children, but are still at school and experiencing all of these things. So the way in which I kind of categorise adolescence for the sake of my thesis is to look at experiences between the age of about 11, so what now we consider kind of secondary school age, and 21, bearing in mind that the age majority doesn't come down from 21 to 18 until 1969. And my final kind of definition caveat is I'm going to use the expression sexuality throughout this paper, and I am using it in the sense of both romantic and sexual relationships and experiences, and not in terms of sexual orientation. So when I was recruiting participants for my project, I didn't discriminate against non-heterosexual individuals coming forward. The call for participants was basically anybody who was a teenager in this time period, please come and talk to me about what you did with each other. But across kind of 48 interviews, I think sexual orientation as an issue came up in maybe 3 of them, and only 2 explicitly identified as, or one explicitly identified as being bisexual and another one as being homosexual. So that's the kind of project setup bit done. So in terms of the big idea that's kind of driving my thinking at the minute, what I seem to think is, or what I do think, is the fundamental change in the mid-20th century is the idea that marriage was losing grip as the defining context of romantic relationships and sexual experiences. So in these works, which look at a variety of kind of female experiences in the first half of the 20th century, marriage is kind of the dominant frame. And I mean, in some ways that's very obvious in the terminology that we use to talk about sex. So across these books and plenty of other histories of early 20th century social life, we talk about kind of premarital sex and post-marital sex. Kind of marriages kind of got all of the gravity, and everything kind of relates to that. So marriage marks a watershed moment in the lives of young women. And so courtship in relation to this is always forward-facing. So the idea of, I don't like using the expression dating because it doesn't really work in this context, but the intended destination of partnered social activity is marriage. And so in the histories that are being told in these works, courtship is kind of positioned as a precursor to marriage, and then marriage itself is the threshold between girlhood and womanhood. But when examining adolescent experience and sexuality in the mid-20th century, that notion of courtship, with its kind of deeply embedded roots in the inevitability of marriage, becomes highly problematic. So as I've said, at this time the kind of structuring power of marriage is losing potency. So whilst my interviewees and kind of social discourse more broadly suggests that marrying for love remains an important ideal, and Claire Langhammer's excellent The English in Love kind of does a lot, or talks about that far more eloquently than I can. Actually, when you look at teenagers and what they're getting up to and how they feel, sexual activity in particular or marriage is increasingly distanced from the onset of sexual and romantic experiences. So the appropriate context for sex is no longer determined by kind of the exchange of wedding vows, but instead is informed by considerations of age and relationship status and place. So what I want to do with the rest of this paper is to highlight in particular the kind of fleeting nature of adolescent relationships and sexual encounters in this period, and to focus on individuals' kind of disregard for any notion of the future or kind of permanence. So looking at social cultures within schools and early adolescence, as well as the kind of liberated social lives of individuals who left home in their late teens, kind of facilitated by the early school leaving age. I want to argue that the increase in teenage intercourse in the mid-century represents not just a moving up of the time frame of inevitable marriage. So it's not just that people are doing these things earlier so they then, in parallel, getting married sooner, but rather a kind of fundamental reframing of what heterosexual relationships were and what they meant. So unlike early 20th century romantic cultures, in which courtship was a means of meeting a partner and then testing out whether you wanted them to be your lifelong mate, many teenagers across the mid-century had numerous one-off experiences and short-term relationships and expected to have sex before marriage. So whilst romance narratives continue to push the importance of finding the one, teenagers of the 50s, 60s and 70s saw relationships as a nice way of spending time in pleasant company, and saw sex not only as a kind of symbol of a committed relationship, but as a fun way of entertaining themselves. So the relationship between courting and leisure, and this is where I kind of bring this all into line with this whole seminar series, hasn't been rejected entirely. Obviously, like that Claire Langhammer's first book, Women's Leisure in England, has leisure in the title, and has chapters on courting. And her work and the work of Penny Tinkler has been particularly valuable in exploring how courting behaviours and heterosexual ideals kind of shaped gender identities, and in particular kind of girlhood identities in this type of time period. Quite where sex fits into those narratives, I'm going to talk a bit more about later, because that's less clear. So then one of the big questions that my thesis seeks to address is whether or not sexuality itself can be seen as a form of leisure. So how should we understand the hours of a teenager's life that are spent engaging in pleasure acts that range from kind of masturbation to kissing to heavy petting, and then finally to penetrative intercourse? Should the petting sessions, we should make this a drinking game, should the petting sessions that occurred kind of between dates to the cinema and kind of being delivered to your parents' doorsteps be considered just a kind of component part of that courtship practice, that dating practice, or is it something else? And what significance should we place upon dates, although again I can say that the expression is awkward, that didn't become relationships? So when looking at kind of girlhood in the kind of 1950s in particular, Penny Tinkler talks about how for young women in particular, pressures to get a boyfriend started early. As with today, the assumption of heterosexual coupling, which is an expression that we'll come back to a couple of times, underpinned much of adolescent practice. And if you look at girls' magazines from this period, Tinkler's assertion seems to very true. So the girls' magazines of this period dedicated vast amounts of space to discussions of romance and sexuality. So this is a period in which Jackie magazine still contains lots of their pages are kind of consumed with comics, and the comics are very often romantic. They vary from quite realistic girl meets, well, I say realistic, kind of pseudo-realistic stories of like girl meets boy at coffee bar, they go on date, fall in love, eventually she lets her hair down, they always let their hair down. To slightly more ridiculous, my Donny Osmond poster came alive and now he's my boyfriend comments, which is my personal favourite. There are features on kind of how to better, or there were features on how better to make, better attract boys, so that's the kind of 21 ways to make him notice you segment there. And plenty of quizzes to assess like relationship status. And more importantly, to assess attractiveness. So this is Jackie, which is kind of meant for, I guess, kind of 13, 14, 15, 16-year-olds, maybe slightly older. And in the mid-70s, they have segments on how sexy are you. And those flares are really quite special. So as all of these titles suggest, the magazine spent a lot of time teaching girls how to attract boys, how to kind of trick boys into initiating relationships with them, and then like, kind of telling the girls how they can best maintain these relationships. And this all seems to kind of confirm Tinkler's thesis that being in a heterosexual relationship kind of unlocked a higher echelon of leisure activity, that there were leisure activities that you kind of had to have a boyfriend or girlfriend in order to be able to be involved with. But I think we have to be a bit careful of simply seeing courtship as a servant of these quite formalised leisure practices. So I think we could benefit from kind of flipping the frame slightly and attempting to understand courtship and sexual activity as a form of leisure activity in and of themselves. So the teenagers that I'm going to talk about, they didn't just see their relationships as a vehicle to better leisure activities, although some of them, in some contexts, they did. Or as their future husbands. They definitely didn't see their boyfriends as that. But pursued relationships for their own ends. And the factors that affected how they kind of navigated their sexuality varied quite widely. So this kind of ulterior motive, I suppose, is evident in the testimony of Alison, who was born in 1960, so she's like very much at the younger end of my interviewee spectrum. And she described how, having moved to a new town at 16 in order to pursue her A-levels, she acquired boyfriends as an easy means of having company. I'm sorry, I originally had clips to play, which would have made this sound much more interesting, but instead I'm just going to read them out in my delightful Midlands drawl. Apologies, I'm terrible at accents, so I won't even attempt that. So I didn't have any friendship group that was pursuing the same ambitions as me. I was quite sort of isolated in that, so the guys I ended up hanging out with, one at a time, were, for want of a better phrase, were all working class, blue-collar workers, and I'm not. I think the attraction for me was just having someone to talk to and having company, human company. So Alison came from a middle-class home and she hoped to go to university, but she had just moved back from Jamaica, where she had spent pretty much all of her childhood, to a small town that was dependent on the steel industry, and she felt very detached from her peers. She felt that she was never going to make friends with any of the girls in her year at school because, in her words, most of them were pregnant at 16 or 17. But that instead, again in her words, being a little bit exotic, reasonably pretty, and everything that might be popular from a boy's point of view, she instead pursued relationships with boys. She saw no long-term future for these relationships, but enjoyed the kind of temporary comfort and company that they provided. And so elsewhere, the idea that relationships were just a fun way to spend time was articulated by Tracy, who suggested that her partners were completely interchangeable. So she's, one of the very youngest ones. We always used to hang around together at George's Hall. In fact, there were a couple of boys, we used to pass them amongst us. There was one guy, yes, and he went backwards and forwards between me and my friend about 7 times. To which my question was this fraught with drama or was this kind of casual? To which he responded, I think it was probably casual. I think it was kind of, I don't know why he went backwards and forwards. I just remember that he did. I went out with him 5 and she went out with him 7 times. Then we dated twins. That was interesting. So Tracy is one of the younger participants in my study, and I know that you shouldn't have favourite interviewees, but Tracy is mine, mainly because she has the most hilarious virginity story, which involves her kind of dog sniffing around while her and her boyfriend are having sex for the first time. It's probably not very ethical, but I definitely recommend having interviewees having a white wine spritzer while doing their interview. It loosens them up, it's great. But she was a teenager at the height of disco, and while she kind of talks about how liking her boyfriends was fine, but really what her and her friends wanted was a good dance partner. And so in that way, what she says kind of confirms what Tinkler's saying, as in having a partner meant that you could do certain types of leisure activity that you might not be able to do if you didn't have a partner. But what's really interesting about this quote in particular is that she gives this testimony in response to a question about how her and her friends talked about sex. So you'll notice that her descriptions of her boyfriends, I mean, there are a couple, she mentions kind of 2 or 3 of them here, but throughout her interview, are entirely devoid of any kind of emotional sentiment, and have no sense of kind of attachment whatsoever. And so whilst, yes, there is definitely a kind of sense that having a boyfriend let you do things that you might not otherwise do, there's also an aspect here where the significance of having boyfriends was that it gave her something to talk about and do with her friends. So in some ways there's almost an incentive for them to do this whole boyfriend swapping thing, because it gives them something to talk about. And the boys become slightly incidental towards compared to these female friendship dynamics. So interviewees kind of entered relationships for a variety of different reasons, and these experiences were far from the kind of beta marriage models that you often hear of. And more than this, interviewees also kind of resisted being pushed into relationships with potential marriage material. Numerous of my interviewees kind of talk about ongoing fights that they had with their mothers about the boy next door, or their mother's best friend's son, who their mothers thought would kind of be perfect for them. And there's also, this next interviewee kind of demonstrates the continued potency of the idea that girls went to university just to meet their husbands. So Daphne tells of her refusal to go to a university-organised singles mixer. She says, in the first year I was in the halls of residence, they arranged what they called an arranged lunch to jolly us all along, you see. And I can remember saying, I'm sorry, I'm not going on a blind date arranged by the university. And I didn't go. But everyone else went. And but there was just something there. I thought, hey, I'm not being fixed up. Thank you very much. You know, I'm my own person. So Daphne wasn't opposed to long-term romantic relationships. When we talked about her school day boyfriend, she kind of describes herself as being steadfast. Not very long after this, I think it was the last term of her first year at university, she met the man that she went on to marry. But as a bright young woman who had just gotten to university, and in her words went with the intention of letting her hair down, she resented the idea of kind of being set up and pushed into marriage. So I think we need to be quite careful of the temptation to potentially dismiss all teenage relationships with their kind of comparatively short shelf lives as being emotionally or personally insignificant. But the testimonies from my interviewees suggest that in order to fully appreciate the worldviews and experiences of young people in the mid-century, we need to move away from our kind of default focus on marriage and consider the aspects of adolescent relationships and sexuality that didn't involve deep emotional investments. So while there may indeed have been an increasing association of adolescent leisure with heterosexual coupling, it's important to recognise that this was not necessarily confined to formal, permanent relationships, and also that coupling could involve fumbling around in somebody's bedroom as much as it meant going on a date to the cinema. So teenagers often engaged in sexual behaviours that they didn't consider to be their boyfriends and whom they had no intention of being romantically attached to. And I think this aspect of what I'm saying go backwards and forwards with. But sexual activities, I think it's worth saying, aren't just one aspect of courting behaviour. Like, they're not just something that happens at the end of a date, but that they can be pursued or could be pursued as leisure activities, or as pastimes or things to do in their own rights. So whilst kissing and petting or penetrative sex could have romantic connotations, and for many of my interviewees they did, at times they were conceived of as merely good fun. So within my interviews, the sentiment of one-night stands was widely articulated by my interviewees who had moved to London or other big cities upon leaving school, so usually between the ages of 16 and 18. And here I think it's the fact that they move away from home and have their own space. It's important to remember this is a time period where most of my interviewees, when they lived at home, shared bedrooms with siblings. So whilst the kind of bedroom cultures kind of approach that Angela Robbie takes is really interesting, that doesn't fit a history of sexuality in my time period particularly well. I guess one of the other questions that my thesis is asking is what do bedrooms have to do with teenage sex in this period, and quite often it's not a lot. It's also to do with the ease of getting around. The mid-20th century, you're kind of looking at the height of like quasi-ruralism and the suburban living, which created quite a lot of problems for teenagers in terms of how do you get to youth club. We were talking on the way up, like, what do you do about youth clubs in the middle of nowhere where your dad has to drive you everywhere and then kind of sits in the car dawdling on the curb waiting for you to finish. And then also the standard argument about youth culture in the mid-century, that these people finally had money, so they finally had the resources to be able to sit in the pub all evening with somebody that they had just met. So Jacqueline is a London native, and she described her social life having left home at 16. The sexual atmosphere was my next flatmate, she was great. She had loads of boyfriends. So she used to sleep with them all, and I remember having to lock one in the bathroom. He had to stay in the bathroom because another one had just come to the party, and she had to get rid of him before the other one. So he stayed in the bathroom. I always remembered that. So not only did Jackie's flatmate have multiple sexual partners, she had multiple sexual partners at the same time in a storyline which I'm sure has been done by every 90s sitcom going. And kind of similarly, Sandra recalled, I went into digs, so I just rented a room in a house. There were a few physical encounters that I had. I remember it being okay, but sort of not big love or anything. A few things, just meeting people at parties, just kind of getting it together. Now, my work suggests that we do need to do a lot more to nuance rather romantic histories of swinging London, but its testimonies like this make clear for many young people in the 1960s there was an attitude of loose sexuality, so we say. So stories of changing rooms in famous London fashion boutiques being right next to the window so that men could look at the girls in the changing rooms as they walked past the window. Stories of women staying overnight with men just because they didn't want to have to get the night bus back out to their homes on their own. And stories relating to kind of the expectation that if you went on a date with someone, it was kind of required that you slept with them. All of these things cast liberation narratives of London in the 1960s in doubt. But for many young women at the time, emotionally detached good time sex was a socially accepted norm. And I think it's also important to note that one-time sex wasn't just something that people who had already had sex did. So numerous interviewees, including Sandra, had sex for the first time with somebody that they weren't in a relationship with. Kathleen, who moved to London at 16, described having sex for the first time with one of her upstairs neighbours when her housemates were away. He didn't become my boyfriend or anything, it was just a one-off, and he was going to go off on the Sunday. I wasn't in love with him, it seemed like that's what people quite often did. So I didn't feel all, oh, this is a bad thing to do, or anything like this. It was just one of the ways you might get initiated, really. So whilst narratives of virginity loss place, or whilst traditional narratives of virginity loss place kind of huge emphasis on losing your virginity as a kind of rite of passage, for interviewees such as Kathleen, having sex for the first time required a partner. I mean, it definitely needed one of those, but it didn't necessarily require any kind of emotional commitment. No, I don't want to do that. The fleetingness of adolescent sexual experiences is even more apparent if we broaden our focus to consider sexual acts beyond penetrative intercourse. So with lower stakes attached, so there's no risk of pregnancy, and there's far less kind of social stigma, mainly because people just don't talk about it. Teenagers in the 50s, 60s and 70s engaged in pleasure acts as a source of leisure activity. So Sandra from the previous slide told me about how the appeal of one of her boyfriends was that he happened to have a particularly large car, which meant that they could just drive off to a kind of relatively secluded spot and, I think in her words, fumble around, which was fine until one day a policeman came and knocked on the fogged up window and politely asked them to move along and, shouldn't you be getting home now, dear? So, and again, like, whilst these kind of, I hate pre-penetrative, but kind of pre-penetrative acts could be linked to romantic relationships. They were often kind of passing entertainment of very little deep significance. So holidays and school trips were the context of many consequence-free sexual dabblings. And so here too, I think you get the sense that being away from home led to a slight kind of increase in debauchery. Part of the point was that they wouldn't last longer than a week. So one of my interviewees referred to going on tour with the orchestra, provided a unique opportunity for, in his words, the sections of the orchestra to come together. So being away and out of normal contexts created license for having new experiences. And I think the distance also allowed for a degree of experimentation, safe in the knowledge that you could do something really embarrassing, and hopefully if it was with somebody you met while you were on holiday in Italy, then at least nobody that you knew would find out about it. And even milestones deemed to be significant in traditional romance narratives could be fleeting in significance. So if you think about the sheer amount of pages dedicated in Jackie, dedicated to a girl's first kiss, which there are many, in terms of comics which deal with that, but then also agony aunt columns which deal with, what if I have terrible breath, or I've never kissed a boy and I don't know what you have to do with your face. For many of my interviewees, like, even this becomes quite fleeting in significance. So this is Audrey. I remember when I was 14, I went to a dance at the village hall and it was used, she sighs, The Animals, House of the Rising Sun. Good track. Had my first kiss. Oh, I can remember that. Can't remember anything about him. So was your first kiss with someone you had just met at the dance? Yeah, slutty behaviour. So Audrey is kind of like jokingly judgmental of her past behaviour. And it's telling that she kind of remembers the song that it happened to, but can't remember anything about the boy it was with. So something supposedly monumental, Jackie would have us all believe this is a huge moment in her life, happened spontaneously and had no kind of meaningful consequences. Amongst teenagers, snogging culture, again a horrible phrase for which I can't think of any alternatives, was rife and a favourite activity for when parents had gone out for the evening. Quite a few of my participants spoke of how they'd have small gatherings of friends who would meet at their houses when their parents had gone out to play bridge on a Sunday evening. And some of these, they're just like, they were very quite civilised. They'd play cards and their parents would leave them kind of leftovers from Sunday lunch to eat. And others, they were just like, no, we were all snogging and I just had to, like, there was a special technique to making sure that you kind of left the room at the right time to take all of the tissue stuffing out of your bra so that they wouldn't notice. Other interviewees characterised their local youth clubs as little more than a pickup joint. He talked about how certain youth clubs would have a one-in, one-out policy so that there was supposedly no fraternisation between the members, but any experienced youth club goer knew the areas you could go without surveillance to kind of go off and have a fumble, and the darkness of organised dances offered space for, in Tracy's words, a poke. The cornerstone of adolescent social life, though, was the Saturday night house party, and obviously this is much more common amongst those who had kind of left home. So Hazel emphasised that all it took to host a typical 60s party was, quote, loads of French bread, lumps of cheese, lots of crisps, and lots of cheap wines and party sevens, which she informed me are kind of these giant cans of beer, which held 7 pints and needed tapping. That sounds remarkably civilised, and I did tell her this in the interview, kind of like brie and a breadstick. That's quite impressive. Most of the others, however, kind of focused on the sexual potential of such gatherings. So Jacqueline, I remember we had loads of parties too, because parties were, if you fancied somebody, you just invited everyone you knew, and then you and the person you fancied, hoping to get off with them. And similarly, Doris, my memories would start with going to parties. You always went to a party on a Saturday night, somewhere, somebody's house usually if their parents had gone out, and of course you had rock and roll, you danced and you drank, and you'd try to get off with someone, or somebody. Sex was thus an integral part of house party culture. This wasn't just a case, however, of kind of leisure activities only being available to the pre-coupled. Instead, kind of the party's function is to facilitate coupling of a biblical sense. House parties were held to kind of create the context for getting together. Alcohol was consumed to kind of make much easier the kind of ease in introductions and hideous small talk. Music was there to provide a soundtrack, and then hopefully there was a spare bedroom where you could go with your intended partner. So I think one of the things that I guess to kind of conclude what I want to say is that there are kind of two questions in my head in terms of what this paper is trying to do and in terms of what I'm trying to get my thesis to do. The first of which is sex leisure? Can we think about sex as leisure? And then the second one, which maybe I did a better job of explaining, is does marriage have any relevance to adolescent sexuality in the mid-20th century? So in relation to the first question, I'm convinced that we need to kind of see sex as a form of leisure. I'm not really sure in this time period that you can escape the draw of teenagers to kind of the fun side of sex. But I'm not quite sure yet where it fits within existing narratives of courtship as leisure, and whether or not we need to see sexuality as part of courtship or something quite different, and where do you draw the line between those two things. What I do hope that I've kind of been more convincing on is suggesting that this testimony complicates narratives that suggest that you enter your late teens, you then court for a while, meet your future husband, and then marry them and have sex with them. Sexual activity in this period was kind of increasingly distanced, not only from marriage, but any kind of permanent relationship. And I think there's much to be gained from trying to move beyond seeing adolescent courtship and sexuality as simply a vehicle to marriage and a key to existing leisure pursuits. So rather than dismissing these experiences as being insignificant because they were temporary and fleeting, maybe we should see the fact that they had become temporary and fleeting as a kind of change in historical sexual attitudes and practices in and of themselves, and potentially even a changing perception of what constituted leisure. Thank you.
Thank you, Hannah. Our second speaker is Charlotte Clements. Charlotte recently finished her PhD at the University of Kent. She's currently teaching at the UCL Institute of Education and at the University of Kent, and is also a research assistant on the British Academy Research Project, digitising the mixed economy of welfare in Britain. But today she's going to be speaking about something based on her, giving a paper based on her PhD research entitled Oral Histories of Youth Clubs and Leisure in London and Liverpool from 1958 through to 1985.
Thank you very much for inviting me. We touch on some similar things here, but rather than draw them out now, I think we'll just maybe deal with them as we get to them. I'm going to, funnily enough, for a paper titled Oral Histories, I'm going to actually begin with a quote from one of my documents. I vividly recall an occasion a few years ago when I had been expatiating, perhaps a little smugly, in the language of grown-ups, upon the proper use of leisure by the adolescent. A youth saying to me that the problem of his leisure was that someone else was always trying to use it for him. And so this paper is trying to get away from adult-centred interpretations of appropriate youth leisure to try and examine the experience of youth clubs from the perspectives of members, with a little bit of help from youth workers thrown in for good measure, to look at these experiences in their own terms. And so this paper explores the role of the youth club in the everyday lives of former members from clubs in South London and Liverpool between 1958 and 1985. And I'm arguing that in the post-war period, there has not really been any such thing as a typical youth club or indeed youth club member. And instead, I'm trying to get across the idea that a range of geographical, historical and social factors have shaped the youth leisure cultures found within clubs and the wider youth cultures of which these were a part. And ultimately, I argue that youth clubs have kind of been marginalised in our understandings of youth culture by a focus in a lot of the literature on sort of the commercial sides of leisure, the consumerist elements of it, and particular focuses on deviant youth. But actually, in the period sort of 1960s and 1970s, approximately 1 in 3 young people spent, they think, approximately 3 months in a youth club. So we have to see youth clubs as an important site of youth leisure and youth culture. Boring oral history methodology, Claxon. I conducted 19 interviews in Liverpool and South London, and my interviews covered a range of people involved with youth clubs and youth organisations. I interviewed former members, club leaders, workers, detached youth workers, volunteers, members of management committees, staff at youth club associations and city sort of voluntary services organisations, Her Majesty's inspectors and trustees. Many of the people who went on to be involved in youth work were former youth club members, and in these cases quite often I interviewed people in both capacities, which can be slightly problematic. A lot of my sample have got this kind of double involvement in youth clubs, but actually the accounts from these people were not markedly different to people who I interviewed in their sole capacity as a former youth club member. My sample was self-selecting. It was recruited through local libraries, online, via an excruciating experience on local radio, and via personal connections between different interviewees. And I think we do need to be aware that adults' recollections of their younger selves can be problematic, that are prone to a certain type of exaggeration and nostalgia. And I'm aware of this at several points in some of the quotes I'm going to put in front of you. But one of the things I did find is that having the focus of the youth club in the interview was quite helpful in mitigating some of the worst of this. I'm going to begin by briefly introducing some organisations and a couple of my interviewees before looking at some of the extracts from their interviews and putting them in the context of some of the other interviews I did. So this is Alfred House Youth Club in Kennington, and I interviewed Steve from Alfred House Youth Club in Kennington. He started going in the mid to late 1960s and continued to go in the 1970s. Alford House was and is a large mixed youth club housed in a former mission. It has several large rooms suitable for sports, so 3 gyms. It has a pool and snooker room, a canteen, an outside tarmac space and a basement space, once used for live and recorded music, and one of the places that people might slope off to for a moment with one of their dance partners. Shortly before Steve was a member, a film was made about Alford House Youth Club by Carol Rice. It was called We Are the Lambeth Boys. And interestingly, for our kind of oral history theme, it included interviews with current members and kind of did little biographies of different elements of the young lives of these people. Also very interestingly, but not as well known, is that in 1985, many of these original interviewees were followed up in 2-hour-long documentaries by BBC Manchester. And not only did they revisit the original interviewees, showing them the film footage from 1959 and asking them, sort of finding out where their lives had gone, but it also went back to the youth club as it was in 1985 to interview members there. And rather than talk about the kind of oral testimony in those films, I'm going to leave you, if you're so interested, to go and look them up yourselves. But between the 1959 film and Steve's membership, the club was host to and briefly closed because of clashes between mod members and rockers from a nearby rival club. And this becomes interesting when we consider the interplay between youth clubs and youth subcultures. The size and layout of this club allowed it to run a large formal programme of sports and activities while still retaining space for informal socialising and dances. It had a full-time warden and a fairly large range of other paid assistants and volunteers during this period. James went to Chestnut House Youth Club in Tulse Hill, and it's shown in its present form, which is a nursery school. This club geographically is only a short distance from Alford House, it's a few miles away, but it's altogether different in scope, scale and outlook. It had a kind of small outdoor space, which you can just about see in the photo there, large enough for 5-a-side football. But inside, James said, it had the feel of perhaps like a large house or residential home. It had quite a domestic feel to it. It had some organised activities, it did have the space for that, but far fewer than Alford House Youth Club. And it was run by 2 part-time workers in a quite informal way. And James referred to them as old hippies in the kind of Johnny Rotten sense of the word, meaning that they were kind of older than him and had not, adopted the punk styling of the time. Another fairly nearby club to this was Anne's in Forest Hill, which I unfortunately don't have a picture of. And differently to Steve and James's clubs, it didn't have its own building. It was not untypical in meeting once a week in the church hall attached to the Catholic church attended by Anne's family. And it would be hard to say there were any formal activities in this club and really hardly any adult supervision, with her saying that the couple who ran the club, who also did the sort of church's marriage preparation course, generally sitting in the kitchen with a cup of tea throughout the evening and not really interacting with the young people in any way. Liverpool too had a large mix of different types of club. So Bill attended the Florence Institute in the 1950s, a picture of it, and it was a large club originally built for the use of working boys. But he went on to working clubs occupying variously a church hall, 3 floors of an old pub, and eventually a modern purpose-built club similar to, but not exactly like the one I'm showing here, which was a few miles away in Everton. But I've got the picture up here to kind of show you the standard interior of the purpose-built youth clubs of the time. Bill also, quite interestingly, used a minibus as a roving youth club when he was a detached youth worker in the 1970s and 1980s. Another interviewee called Mickey ran a club in what he believed to be an old industrial school, falling down to the point where they couldn't use the upper floor. But that's where people used to slope off for a sneaky joint. at their own risk of falling through the ceiling. And it kind of shows that in London and Liverpool alike, you have these repurposed and borrowed buildings that were home to youth clubs, and these shaped clubs alongside their purpose-built 1960s counterparts. And these kind of varying types of buildings and leadership shaped clubs. But I think we do have to remember that so too did young people. Membership was negotiated by what was acceptable to young people, what was possible within the club space, and the style and level of adult leadership within each club. Kevin from Lewisham says memorably of the informal club he attended, "We weren't a very structurable group of young people, is the politest you could be about it. We were a boisterous bunch of puppies." So having looked a little bit at some of these buildings, what went on in them and how did they fit into the lives of their young members? And one of the things I'm doing in this paper today is focusing on everyday club life rather than trips and camps. A longer version of a paper like this, or indeed an entire paper, could look at the outdoor activities by these youth clubs and their organisations, and put them within the context of things like Outward Bound or drawing more links with the Scouts. But I'm going to try and stay focused and leave that for another day. So Steve describes his routine, and he says, "Oh, you could do several of the sports in one night. It had 3 large halls, so you might go up and play football for a while, come down and play table tennis. We used the canteen area, get your fizzy drink and sweets and have a break. There would be music playing. You talk to other people that weren't your main group of friends. You would then go up and maybe do roller skating and roller hockey. So you could get involved in all sorts of things in one night." And he kind of then goes on to describe the change within the kind of leisure practices he had within the youth club. So he says, you go in little phases of what was most interesting for everyone at that time. You know, you might spend a month mainly going there to play roller hockey, although you'd still have your football training once or twice. We might have played pin table all night on some nights. It was just novel for a while. But I also have memories of there being music and it being quite dark. Dancing going on. And I think when we first joined, end of the 60s, 70s, music was quite a big part of the club. And so whilst there was all of the sport, there was also a lot of people into music. And the club had this little DJ booth down in the basement area which piped music up to the canteen. And he remembers this dancing going on until quite late, 10 to 10:30 at night. And this all sounds very busy. He had a lot to do and a lot of Steve's social life centred around the club. And Anne's is very different. So she says, a typical night, typical evening, definitely meeting friends along the way rather than going there. So I think part of gathering as the crowd and walking along the street together was part of the evening and all the chat that went along with that. And then meeting up and perhaps spending an hour or two there. It was fairly unstructured, shall we say. So there weren't formal activities. So probably, as I say, I wouldn't have spent the whole evening there at all. She had a much less involved relationship with her youth club, but then it was only open one evening a week. James kind of falls somewhere in between the very formal and the very informal experience. And he says, what did we used to do? Play football, table tennis. They put films on. I saw some films there. We used to dot about a lot, really. Sit around in that living room area where they had snacks and stuff. You had girls there as well. And in many ways these accounts mirror the levels of formality provided by the respective club buildings and the possibilities contained within those spaces. And what I found striking about the kind of interviewees' accounts is the variety of forms that youth clubs could take. These are a self-selecting interview sample, so it's their understanding of what a youth club is that shapes the testimony that they've presented to me. I mean, Anne's club didn't even have a name or any kind of formal membership, no sign-in, anything like that. And yet she considered it a youth club by virtue of putting herself forward to be interviewed. And her club was geographically very close to Steve's and James's, and indeed Len and Kevin's, which I'll talk a bit more about later. But the way clubs were used and the youth lifestyles found in and around them were very different. And so the locality had an impact, but so did the building, religious affiliations and other types of affiliations. So some youth clubs were part of a trade body or a trade union or a single interest or hobby group. Whether they were full or part-time led had quite an impact, whether they were single or mixed sex, and also if and how they divided up age groups, whether they just kind of had a free-for-all or whether they separated off younger young people and older young people. And I guess even outside of these categories, clubs had kind of implicit class and ethnic or kind of racial identities, which added complexity to different forms of youth group that recognise themselves under the term youth club. And I think that the term youth club could be applied to such a wide collection of kind of informal, semi-formal and formal organisations doing so many different things in so many different ways, has simultaneously been one of the biggest strengths and biggest challenges that youth clubs and their associations faced in the post-war period. It meant they were adaptable to local needs and circumstances and quite responsive to things like the national policy agenda. But it also meant that they sometimes lacked coherence and a sense of a collective identity as a body of youth clubs. They didn't have a uniform, a handbook, or a Baden-Powell-like figure leading the way. That has been these kind of things that have been seen as important to the sense of being a youth movement, like the Scouts have had. And John Springhall, in his 1977 examination of youth movements, specifically excludes youth clubs. He deliberately lays out that he doesn't think youth clubs are in any way a youth movement. He says either they do not aim at comprehensiveness in membership or training, or they lack an explicit ideological framework, or they do not include sufficient degree of youth involvement in leadership and organisation. But I think one of the things to consider here is a wider cultural movement of young people and their leisure. Did they see themselves as a form of youth movement or youth movements themselves in terms of their wider cultural lives? And I think this is something that you can look at and it deserves further exploration with regard to youth clubs and also elsewhere. And so this vague definition, this adaptability, this dynamism of youth clubs posed a big challenge to youth workers and the kind of youth club machinery and hierarchy as they sought to kind of justify the funding they wanted. But actually for young people's leisure lives, it's quite a vital factor in making sure clubs stayed relevant in the context of the 1960s to 1980s. But I want to have a look at what clubs were to the former members who used them. Did club members perceive clubs as having a specific function? For those managing clubs, they certainly did think that clubs had specific purposes, and so did people who were studying clubs at the time, looking at them as spaces for transitions into adulthood. Marcus Collins has looked at youth clubs as places for romance, and a few interviewees, particularly male interviewees, spoke of clubs as places where they met girls, although Steve says it was more wishful thinking than actual sex or romance on his part. And it's clear that a lot of, especially the more structured clubs, did see themselves in terms of an educational function. And some of the less formal organisations looked at education in a more broad sense, presenting people with new opportunities outside of the confines of the streets that they lived on. So Kate Bradley has argued that in youth projects like the Hoxton Cafe project, many had the opportunity to do nothing while casually building social skills and confidence outside the parental home or school. Kind of in an environment which was seen as a cheaper alternative to commercial spaces and in cities where there's concern about delinquency and ways that young people are using their leisure time. And she borrows this term from Bailey, calling it rational recreation. And interviewees do give you this sense of doing nothing while being out of home or school, as kind of ringing true for them. So including Anne in her quote from earlier. and James when he says used to doss about a lot, really. And these kind of short quotes, a bit of chat, or, talking about people hanging around in corridors. And what I found quite interesting about doing the interviews is that a lot of interviewees' initial answers to the question, what did you do in the youth club, were kind of along the lines of nothing, not much, or we just hung around. And like pastimes that they were actually involved in, like music or football or hobbies that they were involved in, came out after kind of later questioning. And this kind of demonstrated that their prime reason for going to the youth club wasn't always because it had a football team or because it had specific activities. Quite often it was just that they had a canteen or a space that young people could do nothing in. A couple of interviewees, a couple of former members kind of picked up on the idea that you might learn social skills along the way, but this sense of achieving something while ostensibly doing nothing was most keenly felt by youth workers. And so there's Mickey, who stressed the idea that from his point of view, youth workers, when young people were like hanging around, the youth worker was never just floating. The youth worker was always had in mind planned interactions with the young people in the club. But these interactions had to feel kind of unplanned and spontaneous on the part of the youth worker, and he considered that kind of part of the key skill of being a youth worker at this time. And one of the value of doing oral history in a project like this is where interviewees have spoken at length about what youth clubs meant to them in ways which aren't easily discernible from available archival evidence. And in particular, the idea of clubs as safe space is quite interesting. But interviewees expressed this idea in quite different ways. And again, what's striking here is that you've got clubs really nearby each other in a more affluent area of Lewisham called Forest Hill, and nearby estates in Deptford and New Cross. People are talking about safety and youth clubs in quite different ways. So Anne says the club provided a space, I think, to be honest. And even that was part of the discourse now, isn't it? Of, kids on the street just needing somewhere to go. So to have somewhere to go that was free, was safe, and therefore met parents' and other adults' expectations in that sense. And this kind of echoes the rational recreation interpretation of youth clubs, although Anne isn't really talking about potentially delinquent young people here. But Len and Kevin, who were respectively a youth club volunteer and a youth worker who knew each other through the youth club networks in Lewisham, they had quite a different experience. So they were involved in clubs on housing estates in Deptford, Lewisham and New Cross, some quite well-known estates, the Milton Court estate, the Silwood estate and the Pepys estate. We're predominantly talking about the 1970s here. And for them, race was the dominant issue. A lot of the youth clubs they worked in were black youth clubs. And race was a big issue that was present in the young lives of many of their youth club members as they dealt with racism on the streets. They dealt with kind of local tragedies like the New Cross fire and events like the Battle of Lewisham, where the National Front marched down Lewisham High Street to be met by a counter-protest from community activists. And kind of one of my interviewees describes race and events like this as an open wound in the area. And Len in particular saw how young black men in Lewisham needed safe space in the face of aggressive use of stop and search by the police and racism on the streets. So he says, the handbag thing, I saw it like 30 times. You watch, as we go towards them, that woman will put her handbag tighter under her arm and walk fast. And this kind of horrendous event he recalls where a dog was dropped into an area, a fighting dog was dropped into a children's playground. He says there was racism in the housing allocation structure, there was racism on the streets, there was the police. And Kevin echoes this interpretation, and he saw kind of youth and community work, as it came to be known, with a role to provide a safe space for young black people in Lewisham. And so they see youth clubs in Lewisham for black youth as a safe space in a slightly different way to Anne, who sees it as kind of adult sanctioned space. But these black youth clubs are quite different in Lewisham. They're not plugged into the wider youth club associations. They're not plugged into other kind of youth organisations in the same way as some of the other clubs that I've looked at. Their links were predominantly to community organisations, community politics, local activist networks, kind of left-wing and radical politics. And the youth clubs, these black youth clubs, catered for a wider age range, so like 9-year-olds to 30-year-olds, whoever needed these spaces. And they provided not only a space for solidarity, but also a safe space for cultural expression via things like the sound system nights in clubs. And so while in the black youth clubs you get this idea that clubs were an important site of cultural expression, and it's perhaps clearest there, I think in considering youth clubs more widely, this is also true. Another way in which looking at the history of young people via the history of youth clubs is so illuminating is in showing kind of the fluidity and dynamism of youth cultures and youth leisure practices in this kind of range of organisations that are all using the term youth club. So Steve describes how seasons and other factors shaped activities, but in a wider sense, there is this impression that as spaces which young people kind of transited through, their engagement with youth clubs was always designed to be transitory. The cultures and leisure lifestyles that they had as they passed through clubs were also quite transitory and changed quite quickly. And one way to look at this is looking at the way the youth club interacted with other things young people were doing. Anne says that the club acted as a pre-meeting point for trips to the pub, and that this kind of vanished as kind of the social acceptability of going straight to the pub grew. And she also engaged in the kind of bedroom culture described by Garber and McRobbie, and kind of hung around in her local shopping centre. And there's a lot more work to be done here. Women are quite silent in the youth club. There were less of them, and several interviewees give the impression that women quite often occupied marginal spaces within clubs. So Anne's account is particularly interesting in light of this, how she did have less of an engagement with youth clubs than many of the male interviewees I spoke to. Steve watched football, and football was quite an important part of several interviewees' leisure lives. Music too also featured prominently in interviews. James, however, showed that the youth club and football were part of a delinquent subculture that he was part of in Tulse Hill. So he says, we used to go to Brixton Tesco's, which used to be in the market then. They used to stack their booze up inside the door because they didn't have room. So you'd sort of hang around and quickly run in and grab a tray of 24 and off, bang, you'd run through the market with it. We used to do that all the time, and I don't know how they never stopped it. So you'd have 24 cans of lager straight away. But because you used to go with like West Ham and teams like that, you felt safe. You'd only need 50 of you. I went to Newcastle once, and that was in the early 80s, and there must have been about 100 of us. There was all these West Ham, the ICF they used to be called, and this bloke said, come outside, they're here. And we walked outside, and I'll always remember seeing these Geordies, about 400 of them, at the top of this hill, like Zulu or something. They were coming down the hill, and I thought, we're all going to die here. And these West Ham, they just started walking towards them. And as we got nearer, they slowed down and eventually stopped and ran back up the hill. We chased them up the hill, and I thought that was unbelievable. That was fantastic. And that was what it was about if you followed a London firm. You had that sort of reputation. And so James, as well as engaging with photography classes at the youth club, was spending his weekends getting in fights in various, northern industrial cities. He considered himself first a punk, and then later in the 1970s a skinhead, as well as a bit of a football hooligan. And this and the kind of modern rocker clashes in the Alford House documents show that the subcultural and delinquent were interlinked. Not just in the let's set up a project to target juvenile delinquents or, deal with this group of young people. Actually, young people from a variety of different kind of identities and subcultures were using youth clubs in a kind of non-spectacular, non-visible subcultural way. And so while there is lots of documents where sort of executive members are obsessing about how to deal with the unattached and potential delinquents. You've got accounts like James's, which kind of show the interplay of different lifestyles and tribes which came together to kind of form a young identity. And I think another interesting way to continue to explore this idea is through fashion and the way that youth club members talked about the way they dressed in and outside of the club. And one of my favourite anecdotes is Mickey, as a former youth worker, talking about going on youth club camp to the outskirts of Liverpool. There was a young woman with an iron, an electric iron she had bought from home, and we were going out. Whatever we did, we had to stop about 4 o'clock and go out. Tiny little place. Had to go out for the early evening or whatever, and she was ironing with her electric iron on the gas flames. This was how she was heating it up. I said, Jesus, does your mother know you have got that? No. They then wanted me to drive them in the minibus. I said, no, it's an outdoor weekend, we're going to walk. And the sight of these girls with quite short skirts on, all of them with white high heel shoes, clip-clopping off down the road, was one of the funniest sights I've ever seen. Kind of not willing to abandon their fashions and sense of identity, even when they're camping in the middle of a field in the Wirral somewhere. I think that's quite interesting. And James, again, is quite good on this theme. He talks about how in the club there were punks and soulheads. It was a great mix. Basically, if you didn't wear flares, really. That's another thing. We started wearing straight trousers around the end of 76, 77. So when you went up north and they had great big Wigan casino flares on them, we used to really take the piss out of them. They was dressing like that, almost into the 80s. The Scousers, they used to think they were smart, and we used to just laugh at them. There used to be a record called Everybody Salsa. It was a dance tune, and they used to all have wedge haircuts, and everyone in Liverpool had wedge haircut. So we used to sing to them, Everybody Scouser. There's a link there if we get time at the end. And they just used to change the words and sing Everybody Scouser. But they thought that they were smart and all that, and that they were always into thieving. They thought they were the best thieves, and we just couldn't believe that you could be so deluded. Tim, a former Boy Scout, just remembers when everyone cut off their hair. He remembers people had been kind of old hippies suddenly cropping their hair in his football team while he was training as a social worker. For Kevin and Len, on the fringes of this kind of sound system set of subcultures in Lewisham, they had some other kind of interesting engagement. They kind of helped set up sound system events, for example. And there's actually a project being run locally in Lewisham, an oral history of some of these youth clubs, which is where these photographs were taken in 1977. I can't really reproduce their oral histories, but they're well worth looking up. And they've developed quite an interesting method of doing oral history via music elicitation rather than traditional photo elicitation. So they run an event where they play a song from the old Lovers Rock reggae subgenre and use it to elicit people's memories of it being dark in the youth club and this song coming on and who they might grab hold of at the appropriate moment. And so what you get here is a sense that the youth culture is being shaped by this set of youth clubs. And so I'll show you this picture from their project, where not only have they taken these photos that the photographer took in 77, found the grown-ups and got them to talk about them, but what you can't see as clearly is in the borough map there, they've got kind of 13 of the youth clubs labelled, and they've used this to kind of start to draw out what that network of youth cultures and events looked like at the time. And try not to forget Liverpool here, where Merseybeat was a big influence. You had over 100 bands playing in the 1960s, a lot of which used their local youth clubs. So the Florence Institute, the black and white photo I showed at the beginning, was home to Jerry and the Pacemakers. And this kind of two-way influence between Merseybeat and American pop in Liverpool at this time was noted in Sarah Cohen's study, and I think it's also a great example of the kind of local Americanisation thesis that you get from Adrian Horn in Jukebox Britain. Now, so Kevin, one of my interviewees, saw this fashion in terms of resistance, a la Stuart Hall and Dick Hebdige, who he studied in later life when he did an MA in anthropology. And he saw this in the Black Youth Clubs of Lewisham. But actually James talks about style and fashion in terms of belonging rather than resistance. And I think it's interesting to hear young people in their own words claiming identities and leisure lifestyles for themselves in ways different to the way kind of interpretations have been put on them. And I think interviewees account so strongly that the youth club fitted into their leisure lives, and that youth provision kind of needs to be seen alongside commercial opportunities and consumerism, and the kind of affluent teenager discourse that we have at this time. We've got Abrams looking at a teen market for fashion, cosmetics and music, and we've got Richard Hogarth looking at his concern about mass culture and the milk bar. But you've also got sociological studies by Cyril Smith in Bury and Michael Young in the East End taking holistic looks at youth leisure, including youth clubs and commercial practices at this time. And I think this is something now required a bit more of histories of youth groups and leisure, which I think have tended to be somewhat more separate from the commercial histories of youth. We have to see engagement with youth clubs as a commercial choice because for most people, I think Anne in my sample is the exception, you paid to go to the youth club. You paid your subs, you paid for your drinks, you certainly paid to construct the outfit that you wore to go there. So it is a part of your consumer, the consumer decisions you're making. Just because the club might be run by a voluntary organisation or the state doesn't mean it's separate to these kind of commercial youth cultures. And I'm going to conclude by reflecting a little bit on the use of oral history in my research. I think oral history helped me understand how young people used youth clubs in a way that I just didn't get when I was looking at archives. There were some areas of overlap, but there were some instances where the things the former club members told me weren't reflected in documents that I looked at. And one of the reasons for this is the problems with preserving documents from these kinds of organisations. A youth club like Anne's didn't really leave any documents. It didn't take a membership list, you didn't pay subs to go in. On paper, perhaps it didn't really exist. And some of the documents from everyday youth club life, such as registers and youth workers' logbooks, are really hard to come by. Not many of them exist. They're so everyday that people have treated them as disposable. And even clubs where they have preserved papers, the papers reflect the voices of adults. It's the management committee on what they thought youth leisure should be, such as the quote that opened my paper. And so oral history has been indispensable for restoring the viewpoint of the young club member. And it was in doing this that the cultural value of youth clubs to young people became evident in quite a really vivid and strong way. And they kind of demonstrate this interplay between club, commercial, the consumerist, the subcultural or delinquent. They don't categorise it as this is the history of a voluntary youth club, this is what else I was doing. They see it as all part of the same package. And so this has really helped my understanding of the ways in which youth clubs fitted into young people's lives. I hope you'll indulge my extended quotation from interviews, but it's kind of these anecdotes and testimony which show better than I can the place of youth clubs in teenage lifestyles and show them from a former young person's perspective rather than an adult perspective about citizenship or delinquency or something. I think they show something about the everyday, but that there's a difference between the everyday life of or a person's typical engagement with a youth club and the wide variety of types of youth club that there were out there. And I think I'd end by saying that we need to see youth clubs as kind of uniquely situated expressions of kind of micro-local youth cultures, and that if we appreciate this mix of the local, national, international, commercial, voluntary and state, this can really help and add something to our understanding of changing youth cultures in post-war Britain.
Thank you.